Welcome, brave souls, to another chilling tale from the depths of your darkest fears. I am the Nightmare Maestro, and tonight's story, well, let's just say it might make you think twice about your next camping trip. And it serves as a warning to all those who venture into the wilderness alone. Rachel Moore wasn't someone who typically went camping alone. But after her recent promotion and the crushing deadline that came with it, she desperately needed to disconnect. The Campbell Woods had always been a popular spot for campers, just remote enough to feel like an escape, yet close enough to civilization to feel safe. As she pulled into the nearly empty parking area that Friday afternoon, the ranger's station was already closed for the weekend. Only one other vehicle remained, an old blue pickup truck covered in dust and pine needles, as if it had been there for days. The late September air carried the first hints of autumn, and Rachel breathed in deeply, savoring the earthy scent of decomposing leaves and damp soil. Her therapist would approve of this impromptu trip, she thought. Sometimes the bravest thing we can do is spend time with ourselves. The memory of those words gave her confidence as she shouldered her backpack and began the trek to her designated campsite. The trail wound through ancient pines that stretched endlessly toward the darkening sky. Their branches swayed gently in the wind, creating shifting patterns of shadow and light on the forest floor. Rachel had researched this spot thoroughly. It was one of the more secluded sites, perfect for someone seeking solitude. What she hadn't expected was the absolute silence that seemed to press in around her with each step deeper into the woods. The usual chorus of birdsong was notably absent, and even the chattering squirrels that had greeted her at the trailhead had gone quiet. Rachel checked her phone. No service as expected this deep in the woods. She'd told her sister where she was going, of course, and when to expect her back. Standard safety protocol. Still, something about the growing silence made her skin prickle with unease. As she hiked deeper into the forest, Rachel couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about the trees themselves. They seemed to grow more densely packed the further she went, their branches intertwining overhead in ways that looked almost deliberate. The late afternoon sun barely penetrated the canopy now, creating a premature twilight that made the shadows between the trees seem deeper, more substantial somehow. Had the temperature dropped, or was that just her imagination? The sun was setting when Rachel finally reached her campsite, casting long shadows that seemed to reach for her like grasping fingers. As she began setting up her tent, a glint of something metallic caught her eye from between two large rocks nearby. Curious, she approached and found herself staring at the corner of what appeared to be a leather-bound journal, its pages warped from exposure to the elements. The journal was wedged tightly between the rocks, as if someone had deliberately hidden it there. When Rachel finally managed to work it free, she noticed the leather was still relatively supple. This hadn't been here for very long. The last entry was dated just 3 days ago, the handwriting increasingly erratic as it progressed down the page. Inside the front cover was a name. Property of Dr. Marcus Chen, Department of Environmental Science. The early entries were mundane enough, detailed notes about local flora and fauna, weather patterns, and geological formations. But as Rachel flipped through the pages, the tone shifted dramatically. The academic observations gave way to increasingly paranoid ramblings about movement in the canopy and the unnatural silence of the forest. The journal entries grew more disturbing as they progressed. Dr. Chen wrote about how his research team had initially come to study an unusual growth pattern in the local trees. They'd noticed something unprecedented, trees that seemed to be growing and shifting position at rates that defied conventional biology. At first, they'd been ecstatic, believing they'd discovered a new species, or perhaps an environmental phenomenon that could revolutionize our understanding of plant life. But then people started disappearing. First, it was equipment. Cameras and scientific instruments that had been securely mounted in the canopy. Then one morning, Dr. Chen awoke to find 2 of his graduate students missing from their tents. The remaining team members spoke of strange sounds in the night, of branches that seemed to reach down toward their campsite, of shadows that moved against the wind. With trembling hands, Rachel turned to the final entry. The words were barely legible, written with such force that the pen had torn through the paper in places. If you're reading this, don't look up at the trees. They're not branches swaying in the wind. I've been watching them for hours. They're arms, and they only move when you're not looking directly at them. They took everyone else, the whole research team. I can hear them searching for me now. The rustling isn't the wind. It was never the wind. Rachel's breath caught in her throat as she lowered the journal. The forest had indeed grown unnaturally still, despite the strong wind she could feel on her skin. The hair on the back of her neck stood on end as she realized what felt wrong. The branches above weren't moving, not even slightly. They remained perfectly, impossibly still while everything else around her danced in the wind. Her mind raced to rationalize what she was reading. This had to be some kind of joke, right? A viral marketing stunt or an elaborate prank by local teenagers. But as the last rays of sunlight filtered through the canopy, she noticed something that made her blood run cold. Dark stains on the rocks where she'd found the journal, now clearly visible in the fading light. They looked disturbingly like dried blood. The final pages of the journal contained frantic sketches, detailed drawings of what appeared to be tree branches, but with subtle anatomical features that made them look unsettlingly like human limbs. Dr. Chen had noted measurements, changes in position, and most disturbing of all, what he believed to be a pattern to their movements. "They're learning," he'd written. "They're learning how we watch them, how we think. They're so much smarter than we ever imagined." A sudden gust of wind scattered some loose pages from the journal, and as Rachel scrambled to catch them, she found herself looking at a series of photographs paper-clipped to the back cover. They showed the research team, smiling, professional-looking people posing in front of their campsite. But it was the background of the photos that made her stomach lurch. In each successive image, the trees behind the team seemed to be closing in, their branches reaching out like hungry fingers. Fighting every instinct screaming at her to run, Rachel forced herself to remain calm and methodically began packing up her camping gear. The rational part of her brain insisted she was overreacting to someone's creative writing project, but years of evolution had coded another message into her DNA, one that recognized when a predator's eyes were fixed upon its prey. As she worked, she maintained her focus straight ahead, though her peripheral vision betrayed movements above, subtle shifts and repositioning that ceased the moment she risked a direct glance. The branches seemed closer now, bent at angles that defied both gravity and natural growth patterns. Had that one always been pointing directly at her? The wind had picked up, and yet the wrongness of the scene intensified. Leaves rustled and swirled around her feet, but the branches remained frozen in their unnatural poses. Then shpwai as she heard it, a sound that had no place in these woods. The subtle scrape of wood against wood, like the creaking of old floorboards, but coming from above. And something else, a wet, organic sound that reminded her of celery being slowly bent until it snapped. Rachel's hands shook as she tried to dismantle her tent, fumbling with the poles that suddenly seemed determined to tangle themselves together. Each metallic click of the collapsing tent frame seemed to echo unnaturally in the dense air. The temperature had dropped dramatically, and her breath now came out in visible puffs that hung suspended in the stillness. A sudden movement caught her attention, not from above, but from the trunk of the nearest tree. The bark seemed to ripple, as if something was moving beneath its surface. And then she saw it, a pattern in the bark that looked disturbingly like a handprint, pressed outward from within. Fresh sap oozed from between the fingers, thick and dark, more like blood than tree sap should be. The discovery of the abandoned research camp hit Rachel like a physical blow. Just 50 yards from her position, partially hidden by undergrowth, lay the remnants of what must have been Dr. Chen's base camp. 3 tents stood in various states of collapse, their fabric shredded as if by enormous thorns. Scientific equipment lay scattered across the ground, some pieces crushed beyond recognition. But it was the trees around the camp that truly confirmed her worst fears. Their branches were twisted into impossible shapes, forming what looked disturbingly like a cage around the site. And there, caught in the higher branches, fluttering like macabre flags in the wind, were strips of clothing, including a torn lab coat with the university's logo still visible. Rachel's flashlight beam revealed more details she instantly wished she hadn't seen. Deep grooves in the tree trunks that couldn't have been made by any known animal. Strange, dark stains that traveled up the bark in long streaks, as if something had been dragged upward against its will. And most terrifying of all, a cluster of branches that seemed to form a face, complete with hollow eyes that held far too much intelligence. The camp told a story of violence that made her stomach churn. Laptops lay crushed, their screens spiderwebbed with cracks that radiated outward like desperate fingers. A video camera, its lens shattered, still held its last recording, but the memory card was missing. Among the debris, she found a research notebook filled with thermal imaging printouts. The images showed heat signatures in the canopy where none should exist. Warm, humanoid shapes suspended among the branches. Most disturbing of all was the tree in the center of the camp. Its trunk had split open like a grotesque mouth, and embedded within the wood were objects that made Rachel's mind recoil. Watches, glasses, a single shoe, with its laces still tied. The tree had grown around them, absorbing them into its very structure. And there, half embedded in the bark, was a university ID card belonging to Dr. Marcus Chen himself, his smiling photograph now seeming like a final mockery of scientific curiosity. Rachel's decision to run came a moment too late. As she turned to flee, the forest erupted into motion, a symphony of cracking wood and rustling leaves that shattered the unnatural silence. The branches she'd been so carefully avoiding suddenly sprang to life, whipping through the air with frightening speed and precision. No longer content to hide their true nature, the trees began to move with deliberate, almost human-like movements. Her survival instincts kicked in, and she sprinted down the trail, her headlamp beam bouncing wildly in the darkness. But the forest was changing around her. Trees that had stood meters apart now seemed to crowd together, their trunks twisting and bending to block her path. Branches reached for her like grasping hands, tearing at her clothes and scratching her exposed skin. The path that had led her to the campsite was gone, transformed into a maze of writhing wood and rustling leaves. Each turn brought her face to face with more grotesque transformations. trees split their trunks open like blooming flowers made of bark and meat, revealing glimpses of things that should have long since decayed. She caught flashes of fabric, metal, and what looked disturbingly like human remains incorporated into the woody flesh. Rachel's lungs burned as she ran, the cold air searing her throat. The sounds around her grew more organic, less like creaking wood, and more like the groans of living things. Something wet dripped from above, sap mixed with a darker fluid that made her skin crawl where it touched her. The forest floor itself seemed to shift beneath her feet, roots rising up like serpents to snag her ankles. Her thoughts raced back to Dr. Chen's journal. He'd written about the trees' intelligence, their ability to learn and adapt. Now she understood what he meant. They weren't just moving randomly. They were herding her, manipulating her path with terrifying precision. Each time she tried to turn back toward the parking lot, a wall of branches would force her to change direction, driving her deeper into the woods. Behind her, she could hear the sounds of pursuit, not the crash of breaking branches, but the deliberate, coordinated movement of something that knew exactly how to navigate this twisted landscape. The trees weren't just alive. They were working together, communicating in ways that defied everything she thought she knew about the natural world. The clearing appeared so suddenly that Rachel nearly ran straight into it. The moonlight streamed down unobstructed, illuminating a perfect circle of open ground, roughly 30 feet across. In the center stood a single massive oak tree, its trunk wider than any she'd seen before. As she watched in horror, the bark began to ripple and shift, patterns emerging that looked like faces trapped beneath the surface, dozens of them, all seemingly trying to push their way out. Her flashlight beam revealed more details of the ancient oak. Its branches were arranged in an unnatural spiral pattern, creating what looked like a massive funnel pointing skyward. Entangled within those branches were the remnants of countless victims, not just from the research team, but what must have been years or even decades of lost hikers and campers. The tree had become a monument to its own predatory nature. The rustling behind her grew closer, and Rachel realized with crushing certainty that she'd been deliberately driven here. This clearing wasn't a refuge, it was a feeding ground. The oak tree's branches began to lower, forming a canopy that would soon seal off any escape route. In her panic, she nearly missed the small digital camera hanging from one of the lower branches, its red recording light still blinking. With trembling hands, Rachel grabbed the camera. The LCD screen flickered to life, showing Dr. Chen's final moments. He'd documented everything: the trees' movements, their hunting patterns, the way they shepherded prey toward this clearing. His final words came through clearly. They're not just trees anymore. They're evolving, adapting. Each victim makes them stronger, smarter. The organic matter they consume, it's changing their cellular structure. But I've found their weakness. If anyone finds this, you have to burn. The video cut off abruptly. The sounds of movement had stopped. An eerie silence fell over the clearing as Rachel fumbled with her backpack, searching for the emergency flares she'd packed. Her fingers closed around one just as she noticed something that made her blood freeze. The faces in the bark were smiling now, and they all wore the same expression, not of pain or fear, but of hunger. The ancient oak's trunk began to split open like a blooming flower made of wood and flesh, revealing a cavernous maw lined with what looked like wooden teeth, still bearing traces of its previous meals. The smell that wafted out was a horrific mixture of rotting vegetation, and decomposing matter. Rachel could see movement inside, shapes that might once have been human, now partially merged with the tree's internal structure. As the branches descended like a closing fist, Rachel struck the flare. The harsh red light revealed the true nature of Campbell Woods in all its horror. The tree recoiled from the flame, its branches writhing in apparent pain. Rachel's mind raced back to Dr. Chen's notes about the tree's unusual cellular structure. Of course, their accelerated evolution, their ability to move and think, it had made them more animal than plant, and like all living things, they feared fire. Rachel threw the burning flare directly into the oak's open maw. The effect was instantaneous and terrifying. The tree's scream was like nothing she'd ever heard before, a sound that existed somewhere between the cracking of timber and a human shriek of agony. The flames spread rapidly through its transformed tissues, feeding on whatever metabolic changes had given it its unnatural abilities. As the ancient oak burned, the other trees in the clearing began to react. Their branches thrashed wildly, no longer trying to hide their nature. Rachel struck another flare and began backing toward the trail, using the flame like a lion tamer's torch to keep the reaching branches at bay. The fire from the first flare had spread to the neighboring trees through their interconnected branches, creating a growing inferno that pushed back the darkness. She ran through the burning forest, the sounds of vegetable agony following her every step. The trees were losing their coordinated movement, reverting to random thrashing as the fire disrupted whatever dark intelligence had guided them. By the time Rachel reached the ranger station, the glow of the forest fire was visible above the tree line, and the first hints of dawn were appearing in the east. The official report would blame the fire on a careless camper. The remains found in the ashes would be attributed to years of unreported missing persons cases. But Rachel knew the truth, and she made sure Dr. Chen's research survived. His final warning had been cut short, but his sacrifice had revealed both the threat and its solution. And if you're walking in the woods one day and feel that prickle on the back of your neck, pay attention to the trees around you. Are they really swaying in the wind? Or are they moving of their own accord, testing, learning, waiting for their moment to strike? And most importantly, do you have a way to fight back when they do? Subscribe for more chilling tales from the Nightmare Maestro.